Good morning and welcome. My name is David Hart. I teach at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and I'm very pleased to see a couple of my former students here in the audience. And I'm a senior fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is the sponsor of this event, and I run the Clean Energy Innovation Group there. Let me first thank everybody for coming out on what's going to be a very quiet day up here on Capitol Hill. I guess as quiet as usual. So today's program is on the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR, and it's about how to improve support for that program and broadly for small business innovation research and technology. Rob Rosansky, who joined our team at ITIF in the beginning of June, is going to present a report that he's written on the NSFs SBIR program. And we're very excited because it's his first report for ITIF, and he's been working on it for quite a while. ITIF, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. It's based here in DC, and it works on a wide range of technology and innovation issues. As I mentioned, I run the Clean Energy Innovation Group there, and we're grateful for the support of the Spitzer Trust and Gates Ventures, among others, for the work there, including the work on this project. So Rob will present the report. And then we're going to hear from a number of respondents. Let me just introduce them briefly in the order in which they'll speak. So Doug Rand is Senior Fellow and Director of the Technology and Innovation Initiative at the Federation of American Scientists, but that's just one of his many hats. Then I met Doug when he was at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, where he worked on an enormous range of entrepreneurship, energy, and immigration issues. Next, Rene Bender, who is the Senior Professional Staff Member on the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and we want to say thanks particularly to Rene and Senator Rubio for setting up this venue for us. So thank you very much. ITIF is in the middle of a move, and this was supposed to be our first event at the new office, but someone else is going to get that honor to debug the equipment at that office. And then the fourth speaker will be Megan Sun, who comes from the House side, the House Small Business Committee, where she's the Tech and Telecom Counsel. So it's a terrific setup. We'll hear from folks who have experience across various aspects of small business and innovation policymaking. So Rob is going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes. Unfortunately, we had some trouble getting the PowerPoint up. So he's going to speak without his slides, but if you're interested in following along, the PowerPoint is on our website on the event page. So those of you who have laptops can do that, but Rob is going to go ahead without the presentation. So that'll be around 15 or 20 minutes. Then we'll hear from Doug, Rene, and Megan for 5 to 10 minutes each, probably. We'll have a little conversation up here, and then we will open it up for your comments and questions. So we look forward to those. If you're tweeting out, please use the hashtag ITIF Innovation. And thanks again for joining us. And now it's Rob's turn. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us today. As David mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you about the Small Business and Innovation Research, or SBIR program, which is a federal government initiative to help spur small business innovation, in part by helping to fill the critical early stage funding gap that many small businesses face. The program brands itself as America's Seed Fund, and the way that different agencies implement this program varies quite considerably. Across many agencies, the program essentially functions as a slice of the research budget that is given to small businesses. But the National Science Foundation has taken this one step further and developed a program that aims to select the most promising businesses, provide them with the tools and support that they need to grow, and then set them free, very much in the model of of America's Seed Fund. In this talk, I'm going to be telling you more about the NSF model and why other agencies should consider emulating it. And the reason that this is important is because essentially it's about how we can use federal funds more effectively to spur innovation, to spur economic growth, and to help address some of our most pressing innovation challenges across energy, national security, public health, and other areas. As David mentioned as well, basically my presentation is focusing on the main points of a report that we're publishing today. You may have seen some copies out there on the table. Feel free to grab one on the way out if you didn't, and it's available on our site as well. I also want to, over the course of writing this report, I had the opportunity to speak with program managers at the National Science Foundation's SBIR program, as well as program managers at other agencies, and I just wanted to thank them for all of their contributions. So I'm going to first give a brief overview of the SBIR program, then talk through the NSF model for implementing SBIR, and conclude with some recommendations for how other agencies can enhance SBIR's impact. So small businesses play a critical role in the America's innovation ecosystem, and many of the sort of most transformational and impactful companies that we think of over the past couple of decades began as small businesses, as startups. For example, in the IT space, Intel, Microsoft, and Apple are a few. Small businesses represent one pipeline through which innovations from all across America's innovation ecosystem, the private sector, universities, and national labs can be developed and ideally scaled up and commercialized for the benefit of society. But the biggest challenge that is facing small businesses is often a lack of capital at this early stage. And in fact, we've seen that recently, early stage seed funding for businesses has been declining with respect to smaller deals, at least. Larger deals are increasing. So data from Crunchbase shows that since 2014, the number of seed stage deals at $1 million and below has been declining, which is about on the order of an SBIR award. This capital gap represents an opportunity for the federal government to step in because the private sector is deterred from investing in risky small businesses. And the growth of these businesses represents a great opportunity for the U.S. So now I want to give a little bit more background on the SBIR program itself, which is one tool that the federal government can use to help fill this capital gap that small businesses face. So first, the program has numerous objectives. Among those are funding small businesses to meet federal R&D needs and increasing private sector commercialization of federally funded innovations. 11 agencies fund the program at a total of $3 billion per year, or over $3 billion per year. And the agencies that participate are determined by their extramural research budgets, or the amount of research that they fund outside of their agencies. So for agencies with extramural research budgets over $100 million, they're required to contribute or to set aside 3.2% of those budgets to the SBIR program. And for agencies with extramural research budgets over $1 billion, they're required to set aside an additional 0.45% to the STTR program, the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, which I've sort of lumped in with SBIR because we typically treat them the same. And the only distinction is that whereas SBIR awards small businesses to conduct R&D, STTR awards small businesses in partnership with research institutions. I also want to highlight that there are 5 agencies that fund the vast majority of all SBIR awards, about 98% of all funding through the program. And those are the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services, NASA, the Department of Energy, and the National Science Foundation. The SBIR program has a very impressive track record. On SBIR.gov, it says that from about the 35 years that the program has been in existence, they've helped their companies develop 70,000 patents, nearly 700 publicly traded companies, and garner about $41 billion in venture capital. And some of the companies that have been brought up with this program include many startups that or former startups that are household names today, such as 23andMe, Apple, Qualcomm, and others. So importantly, agencies have a lot of flexibility in how they implement the SBIR program beyond this basic structure that I laid out. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I realized I One thing I forgot to mention is that SBIR uses a three-phase funding structure. Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3 awards, they're called. Phase 1 is typically a smaller award that small businesses awarded to the program can explore a given R&D idea. Phase 2 gives them usually in the order of $1 million to further develop out this R&D. And Phase 3 refers to an agency's efforts to support a business outside of SBIR funding, which they are encouraged to do. So agencies have significant flexibility in how they implement the program. As examples, agencies can choose what kinds of companies to fund. Small businesses include all businesses with 500 or fewer employees, but there are many types of businesses that can fall within that. Agencies choose what topics to fund within their mission areas. Agencies choose who within the agency will be in direct contact with these companies, and whether that same person is the person who's also managing the program, picking topics, reviewing proposals, and so on. Agencies also choose what other support to offer companies outside of the SBIR program, beyond the basic Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3 awards, although Phase 3 is outside SBIR. Now I want to dive a little bit into the NSF model and how the NSF has addressed each of these questions. With respect to the kinds of companies that NSF funds, NSF focuses primarily on startups because startups represent high-growth companies, and just over experience, the program directors at NSF felt that startups were outperforming other types of more well-established companies. In contrast, many other agencies will fund more established companies for the SBIR program, some of which may choose as their strategy to sort of survive primarily off of the SBIR program without plans to exit, as opposed to startups. The second, what topics to fund, the National Science Foundation has a very broad mandate, and within that, it funds many topics of science and technology, and will also accept projects that fall outside of those areas. The proposal doesn't change year by year, and the requests are fairly broad, not very specific, which is in contrast to other agencies where oftentimes the proposals or the solicitations will be requesting projects that are for narrower, predefined topics based on specific R&D needs that the agencies have identified. As for who works with the companies within the agencies, the National Science Foundation has a relatively centralized program where a team of dedicated program managers who work full-time on the SBIR program, all of whom have some sort of entrepreneurial or commercialization experience, they follow the entire grant cycle with businesses, from the point of seeking out companies that would be good candidates for the program, to working with those companies and managing their awards, to even in some cases remaining in contact with these companies following their awards. On the other hand, many other agencies, the way that they run the program is more decentralized, and the different roles in managing the program, from reviewing proposals to seeking out companies that could apply to serving as a technical point of contact, these can be split out among different people, and the SBIR program may be just a very small part of these officials' time. And then finally, in terms of other support, NSF has pioneered several initiatives that are designed to help enhance commercialization or enhance commercial outputs from businesses. And one example I'll give is the Innovation Core, or I-Core program, which provides a 7-week boot camp training for companies to go through to better understand markets and customers and learn how to commercialize the outputs of their innovation. And many other agencies have also adopted some of NSF's initiatives and pioneered their own as well. And I want to highlight that NSF's story came to our attention because we'd heard that they felt that they had a real success story on their hands, that over the past 2 decades they had really transformed their program just purely through administrative changes, that they felt that they were seeing much more positive results. And again, embodying America's seed fund, embodying a seed fund model. So now to emphasize that a little bit, I want to talk more about a couple of how we looked into the impacts of the program, of NSF's model. Now is where, ideally, I would have slides, but if you happen to have a copy of... right. If you have a copy of the report in front of you, the graphics that I will be talking about are on, I believe, page 12. Yeah, that's right, page 12. Or you can follow along online if you are. So NSF's portfolio, looking through at the data on SBIR.gov, you can see that it is much more rich in companies with high growth potential. I mentioned that NSF targets startups especially, and one way that they look for startups or try to find these companies that will take these awards, grow with them, and then find other ways to become commercially viable is by looking at the number of previous awards that these companies have won. So looking through the data, you can look through an agency's portfolio and see how many companies it funds that have won one SBIR award, two SBIR awards, three, and so on. And comparing the portfolio of NSF versus those of other agencies, it's pretty clear that NSF has a very heavy focus on companies that have won just one award, therefore likely from NSF, and perhaps their first award in the program. These companies are likely to be startups. NSF has about 96% of its portfolio between 2014 and 2018 as companies with only one award. Sorry, I failed to mention we're only focusing on phase 2 awards in this data grab because phase 2 awards, again, those are the $1 million awards for about 2 years, which represent a more substantial investment on behalf of the agencies than phase 1, which is a little bit more exploratory. NSF has over 96% companies with a single award, which is in contrast to other agencies which tend to have between, at least the 5 major SBIR agencies, between about 40 and 20% of their portfolios are companies with a single award. I also want to highlight that a large number of awards in the company's history have gone to companies that are recipients of many awards, some of which may be companies that are using the SBIR program as a business model without necessarily plans to exit it. So a full half of all of the awards in the program's history have gone to companies that have received collectively 10 or more awards. And actually, 10% of all of the awards in the company in SBIR's history have gone to 25 individual companies, each obtaining over 100 awards. There are often reasons that agencies will fund these more well-established companies as opposed to startups. Sometimes they're the best company to do the job. Sometimes they, a given project that an agency was working on may take a decade or more and require multiple SBIR awards. But given the nature of the program to promote growth, these types of companies are not necessarily the best candidates for SBIR. I also want to highlight that NSF, again, it hasn't always been this way. It hasn't always had a portfolio that was so rich in high growth companies. As of the time period of 1999 to 2003, NSF had only 57% of its portfolio as companies that had been awarded one award, likely first-time awardees and startups, which again has transformed to about 96% today. NSF was able to do this, and we believe that other agencies could also shift in this direction through administrative changes to the SBIR program. I want to give a couple examples of the types of startups that NSF funds, just to make this a little bit more concrete. And also over the course of conducting this project and writing the report, this was far and away the most fun part of it, getting to talk to these really exciting companies, many of whom were just a former PhD student or someone who had worked in a laboratory and realized that they had an idea that could tackle a really big problem out there and wanted to bring it to reality. So there's a couple of examples. Clear Flame Engines is one company that I talked to that is trying to develop clean, high-efficiency engines for heavy-duty applications as an improvement on current diesel engines. Opus 12 is another. that is developing a process to convert carbon dioxide into higher value products such as diesel fuel and plastics. Cinder Bio is a startup that's using heat and acid stable enzymes derived from microbes that live in really extreme environments like the volcanic waters at Yellowstone National Park to improve the efficiency of industrial processes. Emergy Foods is working on plant-based whole muscle meats, and Accelerate Wind is working on rooftop wind. So again, really potentially big solutions to big problems that we have out there. And in talking with all of these companies, on the whole, the feedback that I got for the NSF program was very positive. Companies said that NSF's program was meritocratic, that they understood the needs of startups, that the program managers, given their entrepreneurial experience, were really helpful, especially with understanding commercialization. And even that NSF was flexible when, say, research pointed in a different direction to an entirely new application that might be possible. The National Science Foundation was willing to continue supporting that work because it was promising. And then last, talking about the impacts of the NSF program, we have some data on commercial outputs from the program from NSF. Since 2014, NSF said that its companies have garnered $6.5 billion in private investment and have made 87 exits. That is when investors sell their stakes in the company to realize their return on investment. The National Academies also conducted a study of NSF's SBIR program in 2015 and found that among a survey of Phase 2 awardees, 70% had reported sales. The average growth in the company was from 6 to 10 employees, and commercialization had been accelerated according to 80% of those companies due to the NSF SBIR program. And then last, I want to talk a little bit more about recommendations given this model and given its success. So the NSF model strongly supports small businesses with a high potential for growth in crossing the capital gap and supports the commercialization of federally funded R&D. And because of that, we think that there is a strong potential for other agencies to do the same by adopting elements of the NSF model. Again, funding companies with high growth potential, especially startups, and working to spread out awards over many companies. Broadening topics and solicitations to allow for the most promising companies to be encouraged to apply and have successful applications. Centralizing management of the program among dedicated program directors, especially those with experience in commercialization, and offering supplemental programs to enhance commercialization, such as I-Corps, which I'd mentioned before, although many agencies do at this point as well. I do want to highlight that many agencies have begun taking some of these steps, and in particular, the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute there, over in the mid-2000s, underwent a reinvention of its program, inspired by NSF's program, and has adopted many of these measures. And an external review of that program found that it was experiencing very high rates of commercialization. I also want to emphasize that we believe that all agencies could adopt at least some of this model, but the extent to which it's adopted and how it's adopted obviously depends on the agency, its structure, history, organization, et cetera. And in particular, the model is most applicable in areas where there's high commercialization potential for the research that that agency is doing. In some cases, an agency may be working in areas with low commercial potential for research, and in other cases, agencies may be looking to use or procure what they are funding. And in those cases, the model is less acceptable or less applicable. However, there are many areas that can be improved. In particular, I want to highlight the Department of Energy because at ITIF, I'm coming from the clean energy innovation teams. That is a topic of interest definitely for us. And also the Department of Energy works in a lot of areas, a lot of applied research, especially through its applied offices that potentially have high commercialization potential, such as the work of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And reform to look more like the NSF model that office or work of that office combined with others could represent a clean energy startup fund, which could have a really big impact. So there's a lot that agencies can do on their own. NSF changed its administration largely on its own. That said, there's plenty that Congress can do as well to support agencies. As a couple of examples, Congress can make permanent an administrative funding pilot that's been piloted in agencies, which allows them to use 3% of funds for commercialization programs, programs to increase diversity, and others. Congress can require agencies to increase the weight of projects' commercialization potential in funding decisions. Congress can allow businesses to use a small portion of SBIR awards for commercialization activities. Congress can direct SBA, the Small Business Administration, to develop guidance on commercialization metrics so that agencies can better track the impacts that their program administrations are having. And finally, Congress can increase overall federal funding for R&D, which has been lagging compared to historical levels as a percent of GDP, and is not nearly commensurate with our technological and competitiveness challenges that we face today. And increased federal funding obviously would enhance the impact of the SBIR program, since it is a set-aside determined by a percentage of that funding. I also want to mention that some of these proposals, as well as many other great ones, are in proposed legislation that exists today, such as the SBA Reauthorization Act of 2019, coming out of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, chaired by Senator Rubio, and the Research Advancing to Market Production for Innovators Act, which is co-sponsored by Senators Coons and Rubio. And it has a House companion also recently introduced by Representative Houlihan. I will let our Hill representative speak much more to that as well. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time. I will welcome your questions soon after the other panelists. And I want to pass it off to Doug. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I think just want to remind folks that the report is available on our website if there are no hard copies out there, as well as Rob's presentation. And of course, feel free to reach out directly to him if you have comments or questions. And with that, Doug Rand is our next speaker.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Rob, for your terrific work on this report. I hope you all get a chance to devour it either while we're speaking or in the comfort of your own office online. So I thought I would just take a few minutes to talk about my own experience with the SBIR program, both at the 50,000-foot level as a policymaker, as a potentially naive, callow policymaker, and then at the ground level as an entrepreneur more recently. Different perspectives that ultimately point in some similar directions. So I started at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in 2010 with a brand new portfolio to help promote high growth entrepreneurship across the country and across industries. Lo and behold, there's this terrific program that's been around since the 80s, the SBIR program. It's a seed fund for high-tech, high-growth businesses. And what could be better than that? And so we did a lot of work, as cheerleaders, certainly, to encourage entrepreneurs throughout the country to apply for this program. But I think over the years, as I got to know the great folks at the SBA better and the various program managers of the agencies, many of whom are here today, a lot of the kind of surface level understanding I had of the program got a little deeper. And so just as like a Cliff Notes version, I wanted to share that with those of you who may not be living and breathing the SBIR program every day. So first of all, I quickly learned there's no one SBIR program. There's not even 11 SBIR programs given the 11 agencies that participate. There's probably a couple dozen when you think about how many programs there are that work with relative autonomy. So every institute of the NIH basically has its own SBIR program. Every component of the DoD that does research. The Army program is rather different from Special Operations, which is rather different from DARPA. So there's a real diversity and richness of different approaches when you look across the federal agencies. There's dozens and dozens of different SBIR programs. And on the one hand, that's a really great thing. There's basically all these different laboratories of how to support small businesses and startups. On the other hand, I have an immense amount of empathy and respect for the civil servants who work on these programs, because it's really hard to gather data or implement reforms, on a cross-program basis. I think many outside the federal government and outside the small business committees think, oh, it's the SBIR program. But no, it's a couple dozen programs. And, anyone can come up with an idea to make them better. But actually doing the hard work, like John Williams does every day at the SBA to collect data from all these different programs and implement policy directives across such a diverse range of programs is a challenge. And it's a challenge for I think the authorizing committees as well, because there's so much going on under the hood. I think something I realized far too late in my administration tenure was that some of the best stuff and the really best innovations in terms of how to run this program are really happening at the granular level at the agencies, with terrific program managers experimenting with different approaches, many of whom are in the audience right now. I don't know if I've seen everybody. I see Manny Oliver from Department of Energy, and I'm sure there's others that hopefully we'll get to talk to at the end. So there's great stuff happening at the agency level, and there's great stuff happening at every agency for sure. One thing that Rob mentioned is that he could have written a whole paper on the National Cancer Institute that would have looked extremely similar to this paper about the NSF model. But to my knowledge, actually, I don't know that Michael Weingarten at NIH was inspired by NSF. I think it was a tale of convergent evolution, where over a similar period of time you had different folks at different agencies kind of hit on a similar model, really quite independent of one another. And so that's been an interesting thing to watch. So those are some of the observations and things I learned, in many cases, embarrassingly late in the game as a policymaker. Then I left the administration in early 2017, just randomly, and I went back to entrepreneurship and thought, I'm now the co-founder of a new venture-backed technology-based company. It's called Boundless. It helps immigrants apply for green cards and citizenship more affordably. You could think of it as almost like TurboTax for immigration. But we had some really cutting-edge ideas to employ AI and machine learning to improve the product, and this was kind of off the roadmap of what our investors might have wanted us to focus exclusively on. But if we had some extra funding from a federal agency, we'd be able to hire up some data scientists and other engineering firepower to really do something a little more cutting edge. And so we thought, well, let's apply for an SBIR, which was, I think, really great education for me as someone who'd just been thinking deep thoughts about SBIR and talking to policymakers. To actually be an applicant was a really eye-opening experience. And so what I learned at the ground level is, number one, the ability to talk to program managers just one-on-one before submitting an application is absolutely terrific. We chose to apply to NSF for a bunch of reasons, primarily, or not exclusively, but primarily because we could propose our own topic. They just said, oh, well, if you want to do something in AI and machine learning, this is your program manager, go for it. You get to frame the technology challenge you're going after. And so talking to that program manager ahead of time and really getting to understand what they were looking for and how to do this as a newbie was really helpful. Less great about the process was some of the unavoidable government requirements, like getting a DUNS number. I mean, that's not something I think a lot of startups typically do, but we did it. It took a while, but we got it done. Working with SAM. What does that even stand for again? The System for Awards Management. God bless the GSA. They're doing what they can to make that platform better. It's not awesome, but I would say, to be fair, like, these things are hurdles, but they're not insurmountable hurdles. And if you're an entrepreneur, and that turns you off and makes you run away, like, then I don't have an immense amount of sympathy. So I mean, those aren't the biggest speed bumps. They're annoying, but they're not fatal. filling out an application is really hard. When you're an entrepreneur who's used to, going around to investors pitching your company with a 20-slide deck, and now suddenly you're faced with, this very, very lengthy application set of requirements. Our application ended up being 50 or 60 pages long. It was very technical. It was much more like applying for a grant. No surprises. NSF is primarily an agency that, it does competitive grants for universities. And, one funny thing about the NSF program is, the SBIR website is amazing. I mean, it's beautifully designed and it's speaking the right language to entrepreneurs. But then once you click apply, you're kicked right into fast lane like every other researcher at any university. And, it's not so pretty and it's a lot of words, which is, again, if you want to compete, that's something you can slog through. Are improvements possible? Yes. Do entrepreneurs need to be coddled through every step? Probably not. The other thing I learned is that, it's for better or for worse, there's a lot of consultants out there whose only job is to help companies improve their odds of winning an award. And I think before I started, I might have thought, well, that's just, that's an unfair advantage and, we don't need a consultant. But, at the end of the day, we did do most of the work in-house, but it was awfully useful to find a consultant who I could just talk to for a couple hours and who could just read our application and make some, useful comments about, if you just tweak this here, you're framing the message in a way that a program manager might understand better, the way the review panel might understand better. And so I thought, at the end of the day, these consultants, if they're good and have done it a million times, they can provide a helpful service. And I only wish that were more broadly available to a more diverse set of applicants. The final thing I learned as an applicant is that this is a very competitive program. We did not win. You're not a shoo-in. I don't actually know off the top of my head what the percentage is of successful applicants. I think it's 15-ish across agencies. Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean it's very competitive, as it should be. And I thought that it was a fair process and that I understood why the review panel made the decision they did. We got full and transparent feedback from each of the reviewers anonymously. And so even though we didn't win the award, we felt like it was a useful process to go through. So again, I want to thank Rob and the whole ITIF team and everyone who provided their insight from within the agencies for doing this. I just want to reiterate that what Rob and ITIF have termed the NSF model. You can find elements of it at many other agencies, not just NSF. It does this idea of having open topics, a dedicated team of program managers with private sector experience does seem to work really well. If your agency's mission is to stimulate innovation and not necessarily consume the fruits of that innovation, which is true of most of NIH, parts of NASA, parts of DOE. If your agency's mission is to groom the industrial base, on the other hand, then this might not be a copy-paste analogy, and that's true for a lot of NASA, that needs widgets for various space missions, and a lot of DoD, which needs various widgets for weapon systems and other national defense priorities. I really appreciate the recommendations that ITIF came up with, both for agencies and for Congress. I'd also point to a really interesting set of recommendations that the Clean Energy Business Network, which is about 3,000 small businesses doing various clean energy technologies, submitted to the House and the Senate last week. Many of them overlap in terms of the administrative funding pilot, making that permanent, and giving agencies modest overhead to innovate, which I know DOE has used really well, and NSF and NASA and a lot of other agencies. There's also some new ideas in here that I look really interesting. One of which ties to that consulting insight that I had at the ground level, which is maybe it would be possible for Congress to allow SBA or the individual agencies to provide vouchers so that some of the underserved groups at universities where you're not just handheld into an SBIR or regions, we all care about spreading prosperity from just a handful of states, basically giving entrepreneurs something of value where they can actually, hand that voucher to a consultant of their choice and really get off the ground with one of these really complicated applications could really meaningfully diversify the applicant pool. Another thing that is personal for me is, gosh, I wish that NSF 2 years ago had what they have now, which is this project pitch pathway, where nowadays I wouldn't have had to necessarily go through the entire 60-page application process. I could have written a 3-page project pitch and gotten a green light, red light right up front. Hopefully we would have gotten a green light and been invited to do the full application, but maybe we wouldn't have. Would have saved a lot of time. I know a lot of agencies are experimenting with this, and I hope it's of interest to the authorizers as well. So that's my piece for now. I look forward to talking with the other panelists, talking with all of you in more detail soon. And with that, hand it back to David or hand it directly to Rene?
Thanks, Doug. Yes, I'm going to briefly hand it right back to Rene. So Rene Bender is our next speaker from the Senate Small Business Committee.
Morning, everybody. First, I'd like to thank ITF for hosting this event, for the work that they're doing in the technology and innovation space, for inviting all of us to be here today. We really appreciate it. As David mentioned, I'm Rene Bender. I serve as senior professional staff for Chairman Marco Rubio in the Senate Small Business Committee. I have been on the committee for a number of years and served under Chairman Risch last Congress. I've worked in the SBIR STTR space dating back to my 7-year tenure with Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, who was very focused on the SBIR program. I was a member of the Small Business Committee and started my career in the Senate of the Office of Senator Pete Domenici from New Mexico, who's from my home state. So I've had not as much experience as a lot of people that I'm looking at in this room, but certainly have had a number of years of working in the program, both from a rural state perspective and then at the committee level, working both for the chairman's priorities, but also for our Senate members on the committee. And we also do a lot of work with senators who are off the committee. So this Congress, Chairman Rubio took over the committee in January. He and Ranking Member Cardin chose to undergo a robust reauthorization process that included reauthorization of both the Small Business Act and the Small Business Investment Act. When they first met to discuss priorities for the Congress, they discussed the fact that we had not reauthorized the Small Business Act since 2000. So when we're talking about some of the reforms and the ideas that are in the ITF report, other things that Doug has mentioned, it's pretty hard in a lot of ways for SBA's programs and for those administering the programs to be innovative and to come up with new ideas and do different things if the statute is out of date and is not meeting the needs of the agencies, is not meeting the needs of entrepreneurs. And so that was really part of the impetus for the initial sort of let's look at these programs, let's make some improvements, let's see what work. So in framing the discussion for Chairman Rubio is really his focus on how small businesses currently meet economic and global competitiveness needs and how they could further contribute to that cause. So he has released a number of reports this year, one earlier this year on China 2025 and the competitiveness issues that we face from that front, and a second report in May detailing the state of domestic investment. And one of the takeaways from that report is the sharp decline in private sector investment in basic research and development. And so that ties in really nicely with the work that we did and have been doing in the reauthorization process on the SBIR and STTR programs. These programs are intended to fill a gap that the private marketplace is not meeting and meet those needs that small businesses are being left behind. And his view is that small businesses are an integral part of the economic and commercialization ecosystem and how we remain competitive as a country, and that investment in this program is really important. And so we undertook this process. We did 8 reauthorization hearings. Our reauthorization hearing on SBIR STTR programs was on May 15th. We had a number of panelists. John was a witness that day as well and got a lot of helpful feedbacks. Stephen in the audience was also a witness, got a lot of helpful feedback on the process and the changes that we could make as the authorizers to improve the programs. And specifically, there was a lot of focus on commercialization. So in that process, we undertook very bipartisan and Title II of the reauthorization is the SBIR STTR title, and the bipartisan nature is really well evidenced in that title. There were two major pieces of legislation that were rolled in. One was a Shaheen Rubio bill that made the program permanent and doubled the allocation over a 5-year period of time and made a number of other programmatic changes. The second bill was a bill we partnered with Senator Coons on that I believe Robert David mentioned at the top of the hour. That would make a lot of changes in really advancing and putting a focus on commercialization of SBIR and STTR awardees. I'm happy to dive more into that in Q&A. I don't want to belabor that point. But part of it was to try to work towards better metrics on commercialization outcomes, educating contract officers on sole source awards at phase 3, providing some incentive in the peer review process to focus on commercialization, having a commercialization technology officer that would look at the potential commercialization of applicants, look at technologies that may be ready to transition, amongst other things, and help lead the efforts on commercialization reporting to SBA that they can report to us. Because that has been one of the big challenges over time, is that the unique nature of the program being that it's a small business authorized program that's administered at 11 different agencies. You imagine the nightmare of trying to get all the data from agencies to SBA in a way that all the systems will talk to each other and then report to us. And so understanding the challenges that everyone faces, obviously on the Hill, we're very data-driven in a lot of ways. What are the outcomes? What are the metrics? What is the efficacy of these programs based on the information that we're getting? So trying to overcome those challenges by getting to know and talk to our counterparts at SBA, at agencies. We did hold a commercialization roundtable earlier this year and invited all of the agencies to come and talk to us about what they're doing at their agency to promote commercialization, how they're using the administrative funding pilot, for example, as well, and got a lot of good information. And I think, started the dialogue with a lot of agencies as to what we can do moving forward, what they're doing to innovate, and, decrease award timelines and decrease the amount of paperwork that goes into the application process or the contract process, whatever it may be. So we've really tried to be thoughtful in this process and talk to a lot of stakeholders, talk to small businesses, talk to people who've worked in the space for a long time, lean on the expertise of those who have worked in the field, work with our counterparts on the House side, make sure that they knew what we were doing, the things that we were looking at, and seek technical assistance from both agencies and from the participating agencies and SBA. The last thing that I would mention that has been a focus of Senator Rubio's is, in addition to sort of the global competitiveness focus, has been on creating dignified jobs for American workers. And how do we do that? And one thing that the data has shown is that SBIR and STTR, the jobs that come out of these programs, the salaries that these folks are getting are much higher than the national average. And so that really plays into his focus on a competitive workforce, a competitive country, and how this program is a prime example of a good public-private partnership, and also about the kind of investment that we should be making in ourselves to keep ourselves competitive and to get people good-paying jobs. And so I will stop my remarks there, but to say that we appreciate ATIF's recommendations. Certainly, there were a few that we agree on that were from our reauthorization bill. There were several others. I think that there are some really good points to be made about centralization of management, about the value of expertise of program managers who are dedicated to the SBIR STTR programs. We've certainly hear concerns about that with other, when there may be more decentralization and someone only has one piece of the process. There's really value to understanding every step of the process, working with the businesses from start to finish. So really appreciate the work that they are doing, and and how it can further inform our process to make further improvements to the reauthorization bill. And we are really hopeful that we can move forward with the bill and also work with the House on getting some of these really important changes across the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. So our final panelist is Megan Sun from the House Small Business Committee.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I just want to thank Rob and ITIF for holding the event and inviting us all to have this discussion today. I'm going to focus my introduction on the work we've done on the House Committee on Small Business on ensuring that the U.S. remains competitive in innovation and enhances opportunities for women, minorities, and rural entrepreneurs in the tech startup ecosystem. This year, we held a bipartisan roundtable with members of Congress, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and 9 women representing tech startups, venture capital firms, and large tech companies to discuss ways programs like SBIR can support and encourage more women to develop innovative startups. We also held a rural innovation staff briefing with the App Association, where we heard from tech entrepreneurs from places like Kansas and Ohio about challenges and opportunities they face working to foster innovation in rural America. Last week, we held a hearing on SBA Program spurring innovation, where we focused on the SBIR Program and Growth Accelerator Fund competition. In that hearing, we heard from SBIR awardees, commercialization experts, and a former SBA associate administrator about the success and challenges of these critical programs. As the other panelists have mentioned, although the SBIR program has been successful, has produced thousands of patents and billions in revenue, more resources and coordination are needed to drive efficiencies and improve outcomes. That's why our committee worked with Representative Abby Finkenauer to move legislation through the House to require SBA Procurement Center representatives to assist small businesses with the SBIR program. We also held a markup this week to advance a legislation led by Rep. Adriano Espaillat to codify the Growth Accelerator Fund program, and are working diligently to develop bipartisan legislation to improve efficiencies, outreach, and commercialization in SBIR. I've too read the report. I appreciate the recommendations from ITIF on improving efficiencies and commercialization in SBIR, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Megan. So I think I'm just going to ask one question and try to encourage a little bit of crosstalk in the panel, and then I'll open it up. So I hope you all have ideas and thoughts that you'll share with us. So the question has to do, it's a two-part. One is, presumably there's a complementarity between venture capital investment and SBIR. And I wondered if folks could speak a little bit to what that complementarity is. And related to that, NSF and other agencies do put a lot of emphasis on follow-on funding as a metric for evaluating the program. And whether you think that's the right metric, how much weight should we put on that metric, other kinds of metrics that you would want to use to evaluate, particularly the commercialization and growth-related outcomes of the program. So, Rob, I don't know if you want to start on that, and then we'll open up to whoever wants to speak to it.
Absolutely. Yes, I can't speak as much to the venture capital side, but at least with regard to your second question on follow-on funding. So at least in my conversations with some of the NSF officials who were present during the transformation of the program, they found that the Phase 2B program, which NSF runs, which is essentially a follow-on to Phase 2, where companies are able to receive additional funding by leveraging private investment. They found that program, the Phase 2 program, and success in that was a real good measure of a company and a project's viability. So I certainly think that is one very important metric to look at. There are a lot of other important metrics out there that can help determine how a company or how a set of companies are doing commercially, such as acquisitions, IPOs, exits, and a lot of that information is it exists out there, and someone just needs to collect it, put it together, and be able to connect that to program outcomes. And I also want to mention that NSF is working on that, and they hope to publish that at some point soon in the future.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Why don't you go ahead, Renee? Go ahead.
I would just say that one thing that we were looking at, obviously, once you get to Phase 3, either the private investment or follow-on contracts or sole source awards has been a long point of conversation for years. So one thing that we included in the reauthorization bill with this issue in mind is in the SBIC program. At SBA, really looking to find a nexus between the SBIR, STTR, and SBIC programs. So in the SBIC reauthorization portion of the bill, which is Title I, we included an innovation debenture to really try to refocus some of the investment by SBICs into early stage non-cash flow positive firms, which is really not what we're seeing now. The SBIC program generally is later term mezzanine deals because of the repayment structure. You really can't invest in those early stage businesses. So what we tried to do there was incentivize that sort of investment through a debenture, an innovation debenture that would, the repayment process would be a 5% royalty repayment that has no finite timeline in terms of when that has to be repaid. So to allow for that long-term patient capital that we know is really necessary, especially in advanced manufacturing, which is what the debenture is focused on. But though the debenture program is focused on advanced manufacturing, the requirements we included a provision for SBIR and STTR awardees that any SBIR, STTR awardee would also be eligible for this type of investment. So trying to, and we welcome other ideas about how to further sort of take on this issue, but that was one way we looked at to try to get to that follow-on funding that's so critical.
One issue, I guess, which maybe you were kind of pointing towards, David, is that sometimes we're blinded by measuring only those things that are easily measured. And follow-on VC funding, Series A, Series B. It's like a national sport among some people, in terms of like how big a valuation is company X, if they become a unicorn, so on and so forth. And it is an imperfect measure. It's among the better measures we have of how impactful and how much promise a company has before they ever get to revenues and commercialization. Not every company, of course, that achieves major commercial and societal impact relied on traditional venture capital. But every company that relies on venture capital, by definition, has high growth potential, or the investors wouldn't have put their money at risk, because venture capital, by definition, is seeking crazy, perhaps irrational outsized returns, and building a portfolio that can hopefully deliver that. One thing that I kind of struggle with, both from with my policy hat on versus my entrepreneur hat, is some of the restrictions in the program on VC ownership, which is basically VC investment. NSF takes a pretty doctrinaire approach, as far as I can tell. They want companies that are so young that they haven't, by and large, received any venture capital funding. So even if they were allowed to fund all the VC-backed companies they wanted to, they probably wouldn't, although it'd be helpful for them to make exceptions now and again. I'm very understanding of and the concern that many have that if the doors were just kicked open and you could have any cap table or any ownership structure you wanted, that like large companies would find sneaky ways of just having subsidiaries that gobble up a lot of SBIR funding. I'm hopeful there's ways of stopping that without just having a total ban on VC ownership. My company, it just so happened that our ownership structure brought us like really close to the line in terms of eligibility for the program, because we had great investors. We were lucky, we had great investors who believed in us at a very early stage. But one thing I think is a point I didn't fully appreciate that that hopefully is helpful to folks in the room is that even when you're a venture-backed company and it might seem from the outside like, oh, well, they've got plenty of private sector funding. Why would they need an SBIR award? Like I alluded to earlier, your VC investors have different expectations and are putting different pressure than a federal agency giving you an SBIR award. And so I'm sure that my company is not alone in in having the view that an SBIR award would have allowed us to pursue more cutting edge technologies than we would have been able to do base case. Because when you raise money from VC investors, they basically want to know, how is this going to translate into customers like as soon as possible? Whereas the SBIR money has a longer timeline, it's more patient, it's not capital, but more patient funding. And so, I don't know, I feel like that's a maybe more subtle argument for giving agencies the discretion to let more VC-backed companies be eligible for SBIR awards, because I do think it would help some of the country's most innovative companies experiment more and pursue more kind of Hail Mary technologies than they're currently able to do.
Great, thanks. So I hear from my panelists that there's a lot of expertise out there in the audience. I think we would welcome comments as well as questions, but please identify yourself and keep your comment, reasonably brief. We look forward to your thoughts. So here we go.
Hi, my name's Nathan Music. I'm with the Congressional Budget Office, and we've been paying some attention, like a lot of other economists, to recent research that shows that the rate of firm startup has dropped off quite sharply in the past 3 decades, and firms aren't growing as much as they used to during that time as well. And so when you think about, all the positive attributes that new firms have, then you want to wonder, well, what kind of policy response might, address that decline? And of course, SBIR comes to mind. And my question is, when you look at the criteria for applying for an SBIR grant, I think it's like 500 employees or less is the size. But that's really quite a big firm. I mean, relatively few firms in the United States have more than 500 employees. So when you think about the 15% of successful SBIR applicants, those who get an award, are they typically the larger new and young firms, say 200, 300 employees? Or can SBIR successfully be made use of by even the smallest firms, a dozen or so employees? And this may be a question for some of the program managers as well. Thank you.
I feel like the report that we're talking about today really kind of gets a little bit to that question, where and depending on what the agency need is, and I know that John and Brittany and Manny could speak better to this, but to say that when you're funding those really early stage, have not received an award, as Doug mentioned, they may not have no VC backing. They're trying to get them that early. That's where you're going to have the really small startups. So in the larger award category, I think you would find more employees at that stage if they have, if you're getting into those, over 50 award applicants. But my understanding is it kind of varies, and they do tend to be still smaller firms. I mean, 500 is the size standard for small business, so that's the standard that we are going to use. But generally speaking, I don't think you have a ton that are up in that 500. I think it's a very small percentage, like less than 1%, something like that.
John's nodding his head, so it must be true. Right. Yeah.
Did you want to comment on that, John? I have lots. Well, just on this point, yeah.
Oh, okay. And just a couple things. And I'm John Williams from SBIR, or the SBA that oversees SBIR. So a lot of great points. I think strong program managers, is important. But flexibility is important, more help in commercialization, all the challenges. So I more have things for you to also think about in the future. Those things all cost money, and always been the challenge of the SBIRs. Here, take this, it all has to go to the companies. So the 3% admin was a big thing, but it's still only 3%. Typically, it costs a lot more than that to help assist companies. And so that challenge of what is the right amount. So again, is 3% the right amount? How should that be used? Is the new law that was great from Coons and others to put out $50,000 to be able to help towards commercialization activities now on phase 2? So that just kicked in last year. We're all trying to figure it out. Is that the right number? Should there be a range? Should it change for agencies? And so I think it's important that some of your things, and Doug mentioned this, apply well to the NSFs of the world, I think NIHs and others. DoD is very different. They're focused on companies that, maybe they aren't going, when we say commercial private sector, they want to stay. And so there is a balance, and it's important, and that's over half the program. So be careful not to kind of say this is what all should do, because I don't know if that's necessarily true. That said, I think the DoD could learn a little bit by getting newer companies. I don't think your data really shows that these are high growth companies, and so I'd be curious about, because you mentioned companies go from 6 to 10 in 4 to 12 years. I don't consider that high growth. So, and that's your average too. So be careful with that term. I think NSF does invest in high growth, but I didn't see that being proved from kind of what you have, and maybe there's more there. But, the number on the 500 too, is that a good number? I kind of think that's kind of high. But that's been the law from the day one. I know if it ever got stopped, it would be fun for the staffers. But it's a good question. What is that right number? I know ITF likes to float all boats on the R&D side, but we've always kind of also wondered, what is the right apportionments of federal R&D towards big business, laboratories, universities, small businesses? Is 3.5%, 7% the right amount? Other countries, it's much higher towards that kind of translational research. So those are all questions that, I didn't expect answers today, but are really important things to start to continue to look down. And it's been great, Congress is, the bill, and we hope it keeps going there. And on the House side, but some really good, movement towards that, and the elevation of just a real focus. EDA and SBIR are really the only organizations in the federal government that are really targeted towards helping kind of innovation companies move forward. And we put a lot of resources on non-innovation based companies, and I think the U.S. needs to put more on kind of that innovation, and that costs money. And so how do you pay for those kind of things to staff up? Because you all mentioned that, having more staff focused on that, the government side, but also getting access to those vendors and building the innovation ecosystem, and we're a big fan of that. But fast, we actually announced growth accelerators. We made 60 awards for growth accelerators. The press release came out today. We just released our FY17, yes, that's 17, but we're excited, annual report out on Monday. 18's well and away. So I guess there's a lot more data. We're trying to get that data out to help make some of these things, and I know you used a lot of it in your report, so appreciate that. So.
Thanks a lot. I just want Rob if you could respond to the point about evidence for high growth. I think it's an interesting analytical point, particularly.
How do you measure that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the answer to that would probably come in scraping all the publicly available data, again, on follow-on funding, number of employees, wages, or that might not necessarily be publicly, but yeah, trying to scrape that together and track and see how that portfolio is evolving over time, and potentially to compare that against other agencies. That was at least beyond the scope of what I did here, but that would certainly help give a good answer to that question.
Any other responses to Jim? Okay. Other questions, comments? Back.
How are you? Eric Snellgrove from the House Armed Services Committee. You had mentioned this growing trend toward SBIR open topic announcements. DoD with their pitch days. Has there been any analysis done to see if commercialization is more successful with this streamlined process? I know it's a fairly recent phenomenon, but interested in any comments you have on that.
To my knowledge, not a direct comparison either among agencies or over time. The National Academies conducts a study every 5 years, every couple of years, looking at how well each program is meeting the various goals of the SBIR program writ large, including commercialization. But I don't know of any particular work looking into how commercialization outcomes have evolved. But if there's anyone in the audience who has anything to add to that, I'd welcome that.
I was going to just mention the DOE, National Academies is in the midst of a study of DOE SBIR, so
Right.
I
It
don't
should be
know how
really
deep-
interesting. And I mean, from what I can tell, they're going to do a lot of that work to try to pull together data from. I don't know, Manny, you might know more, but that's worth watching. Well, sorry?
I was gonna
Oh yeah, and
say,
TechLink has done a bunch. But one thing, I mean, especially given where you sit, Eric, that I would just suggest for the future is that, I mean, look, I can't even begin to imagine the Herculean task of putting together those annual reports. One of the issues that I think SBA faces and that authorizers face is that at the end of the day, you only get aggregate data for the entire Department of Defense. What does that really tell you? That doesn't tell you if Air Force is killing it and oh, you have broken it out? Oh, that's terrific. Okay, well then it's all done. Great. But I would encourage. I mean, like that's really the unit of measurement should be like the autonomous program management within an agency. So it really should be like, I mean, Navy and Army are each bigger than NSF, right? I mean, more or less, right? So like, yeah, a lot bigger. So if we really wanted to do some head-to-head comparisons, which I think would give a lot of people heartburn, but is probably worthwhile, I think it should be at that level.
And I would also just add that I think John was mentioning it from the front, is that TechLink has been contracted by DoD to do a number of economic and commercialization, economic output studies. And so they've done one on Navy, Air Force, and what was that? NCI.
Yeah, which is great.
And then the DoD, is that one out now? Okay. So the DoD wide report we've been kind of waiting to see when it was going to come out. So it's on now. And I think that, to Doug's point, there are a lot of ways that could be some other comparisons that would be helpful for us to have to understand the broad range. But I think it gives a very good, at least snapshot look of the outcomes of these programs, which is extremely impressive.
I just want to add separately that I think that project pitches and pitch days have been very popular from the stakeholders that we've heard from. And I think to the point that we touched on earlier about commercialization and follow-on funding, the developing parallels between the way that the private industry approaches these companies and the government does can produce more opportunities for these small businesses to leverage the resources that they're getting from the government.
Manny, are you on this point particularly?
Not at this point. I just wanted to, just in the commercialization realm, just sort of raise the issue. For the agencies, we do have missions, and those are public missions. And I know we had a lot of discussion here of funding high growth companies, but many of the companies we do fund, relate to our mission and are for public benefit, not necessarily focused on high growth. So, for example, we'll fund companies to develop RFID tags that'll work in high radiation environments, so that we can, for enhanced work in nuclear nonproliferation. So that's advancing our mission. The company will have a commercial, but we're not necessarily focused on, let's find companies that only have high growth markets. And I think DOE is not alone among the agencies in doing that. So my only caution is, and I think Doug referred to this earlier, it's just not all about sort of maximizing revenue. Again, as a government agency, we have a mission that is separate from private sector investor who may just be trying to maximize their return on investment.
Thanks. I saw a question over here, yeah.
Hi, my name is Rukmani. I'm a AAAS fellow in DOE's Water Power Office. I was just wondering if there's some kind of a gender or racial breakdown on who gets SBIR awards. So, for instance, we know most VC funding goes to men. So is there any study of that with SBIR awards by the federal government?
We did not tackle that in this report. I don't know if others on the panel can speak to that.
It's in our report. I mean, it's broken out as minority, women, socioeconomically disadvantaged, women, and underrepresented states at this point.
And what's the percentage of women overall at this point?
So it varies a lot by organization. So the Department of Education has a high number of women. Some other agencies are different. So it does depend. It varies. And actually, we just got funding from the National Women's Business Council to do a study to try to understand the women focus much better, kind of compared to the men, looking at the different actual technology areas and across agencies, and then some of the roadblocks and things like that. So
right.
We just kicked that off 2 weeks ago.
I mean, one thing that I think is underappreciated about the both current and potential value of this program is that, I mean, I'm not trying to set a trap for you. Like, I'm sure we'd all acknowledge that the percentage of, let's just focus on women for a moment. The percentage of like women entrepreneurs or women owners of small businesses participating in SBIR is way lower than 50%. It's like way lower than population parity. That is not great. That is not acceptable. We should all, care about getting to 50%. However, I'd venture to guess it's more than 1%. It's better than VC, right? I mean, the VC industry is in terrible shape. I mean, it is absolutely just shocking how insular and how unequal VC funding is. I mean, it's breathtaking. I mean, it's like single digits for women. The number of African American women who get VC funding is actually like, in the dozens of people. Right? I mean, it's absolutely breathtaking and terrible. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, like, it's because of an old boy network. It's because of people, a bunch of white men relying on heuristics where they talk about, oh, we're looking for great founders, which ends up meaning like people like me, sorry, not, I mean, I was speaking, anyway. I'm here to tell you like the both unconscious and conscious bias is real. And that means that the SBIR program has this incredible advantage over our venture capital system in that it is totally meritocratic. It is blind. You submit a paper application to a federal government agency with a professional peer review system. And so even though we're nowhere near where we want to be in terms of population parity, there's at least like a path to getting there, as opposed to the venture capital industry where you're showing up in person and subject to all kinds of bias that the VC industry is tying itself in knots trying to figure out how to get ahead of. So I would just say like the returns to investing more in diversifying the applicant pool in SBIR are potentially very large and will have very, very positive downstream effects with the even greater challenge we face with the dreadful biases that infect the VC community.
We've also heard some proposals on improving diversity in the SBIR program. For example, there is the SBIR Roadshow that has visited various different geographic regions in the U.S. We're also looking at proposals to improve opportunities to access application resources, so application vouchers, and targeting outreach to disadvantaged communities and women so that more people can come into the program initially. So these are some of the concept and proposals that we're looking at in the House, because that's something that's very important to us, and have advanced legislation as it relates to supporting women businesses and other aspects.
Thanks. Other comments or questions? Okay.
Kevin, did you agree?
Oh, well, I'm Kevin Wheeler. I work for the Senate Small Business Committee for Senator Cardin, and I've been working on this program for about 20 years. And I wanted to piggyback on what Manny said from the Department of Energy, and that is, I think it's getting lost as people are looking at this program. They're forgetting why it was created, and branding it as America's Seed Fund was smart. It's very clever, but it also is now being taken as VC funding. And as Manny said, that's not really what it is first and foremost for. It's supposed to be solving technological problems that the agencies help for the benefit of this country. And then you want them to be able to commercialize it. And so to say that something is only a success or that we're measuring it based on what their sales were is not right. For instance, there was a famous company, or not a famous company, but a company in Massachusetts that had an SBIR award, and they were the first company, as I know, to discover that when they were doing breast cancer, that you didn't have to take all of the lymph nodes, that you could use a dye and you could isolate it to one. Well, as it turns out, it was not a big moneymaker, because once someone found out how you could do that operation, they all just adopted it. And so if the measure of this is that it's high growth, that it made a bunch of cash off of what was, life-changing, how do you put a value on what that did for breast cancer? Well, then it wouldn't be considered high growth or successful. And yet, I would venture to say it was probably one of the most beneficial contributions it made to healthcare for women in this country. And so I think we just really need to take this back, realize why the program was created. There are 4 tenets, and Doug has talked to me about this. There are 4 tenets of the SBIR program. They are not in statute. Senator Markey filed an amendment to the bill in the Senate to put them in statute so that it was upfront, that is to develop technology solutions for the government, to have economic development impact in your community, to bring along women and minorities in the STEM fields, and there's one more which I'm forgetting. And so this is a broad program, and to narrow it down to only being venture, it is non-dilutive capital, and that is a strength. We all agree with that. But that doesn't mean that it's a venture capital program, right? And it doesn't need to be compared to other venture capital programs. It's first and foremost another way for the government to solve its solutions, which if you go back and read the testimony of the hearings on the House side in the late 70s were because they found that most of the money was going to big businesses and to universities, and yet small businesses were doing it faster and cheaper. And therefore, how did we go ahead and make sure that they could compete? And the solution was to allocate a certain percentage of the federal R&D money so that they could compete against each other. So I just feel it was really important what Manny pointed out, because I think it's getting lost.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more. Did you want to say something? Okay.
Hi, it's Bill Rush at Lewisburg. And I just have a question about, well, first of all, thank you for everybody in the committee staff and all the hard work getting the 3% administrative set aside. That's been just resoundingly beneficial, I think, and it's a great creative use of funds. And part of the wonderful thing about it is that it is a creative use of funds. It could be used by, programs, it seems to be, that are very understood and established, like I-Corps, but also some, new and interesting partnerships to reach underserved communities and the such. I was just kind of wondering, if there's any kind of, or if any agencies have developed their own repository of how they're spending the 3%, or if there's any kind of transparency either on the SBA website. And sorry, this is my ignorance, if there's new programs being stood up. I know that, there's a lot of course, support streams that could be supported by this. And just, I guess, for the benefit of, either folks who are contractors or folks who are, say, scientific societies or national universities with partners who know how to establish these forms of partnerships, they can know where to either compete for this or who to talk to about setting up such a model.
Rene, do you know?
I'm looking at John and Brittany in the front row. It's in the 16 report. So I feel like it started in the 16 report. There was a little bit of an overview of how the admin funds were used, because we have been, the funding pilot was first stood up in the 2011 reauthorization bill with reporting requirements, and we had not, we talked about some of the difficulties of getting information and reporting from agencies to SBA to Congress. And so there was some included in the 2016 report and the 2017 report. And I think that's where, when I mentioned we had a roundtable with agencies earlier this year, really helpful to talk through with them in person how they were using the funds. Because we were in last year's NDAA able to extend the pilots sort of at the last minute under the overall authorization of the programs, which is to 2022 currently. So they're in place until 2022, but I think it was really important for a lot of members that we have some more insights, because there's such a wide range of uses, that we understand how agencies are innovating. NASA, for example, sort of did some IT modernizations to really help their small businesses access their program much easier. Others have used it for different things. So we continue to try to have that back and forth of how how that set aside is being used and how valuable it is. And the one thing that I think we have heard overwhelmingly from agencies is they love being able to use that money for outreach. Some have contracted with SBA to do the road tour that Megan mentioned, which is hitting all of our states. And they do a great job putting that on. So yes, we continue to work with SBA and with agencies to understand how that's being used.
And we're going to wrap up here in a moment. What's the next step on SBIR sort of process from the either House or Senate side? Folks want to participate or get involved? Yeah, legislation or hearings or whatever.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had a hearing last week. We're working on a package of bills. We're taking a close look at what's already in the Senate Reauth Title II to see where we can find some similarities and interests. We've also spoken to a number of stakeholders. I've had calls with a number of agencies, but would love to have more calls with agencies about, for example, the way they're using administrative funds and some of the programs that they've developed using their SBIR funding. So we are very much in some maybe the early stages of developing legislation, but would love to work with our counterparts in the Senate and also the minority staff in the House to push forward some legislation on SBIR soon.
And you've heard me talk a lot about our reauthorization process today, so thanks for bearing with me on that. But we had a scheduled markup for July 24th, and we had some snags in negotiations on Title IX of the bill, which is a regulatory reform title. So the markup was postponed at that time. We had about 100 amendments filed, so those amendments still remain, in play. So we are hoping to be able to move forward and continue negotiations and come to an agreement in a bipartisan manner, which is the same way the spirit of, we had 15 individual bills that were rolled into the reauthorization that were bipartisan. And so we're hopeful that we can move forward with a markup of the legislation and work with our counterparts on the House as they start their process and seeing where we can find ways to work together. And I think there's real momentum for us to try to get some of these, to get these things done in this Congress. So that's our hope.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Renee and Megan and Doug and Rob. I hope all of you will take a look at the report. Please get in touch with us directly, particularly Rob, if you have comments and suggestions. And I also want to acknowledge Stephen Azell from ITIF, who is here as another expert on SBIR from ITIF and testified at the Senate hearing this spring. So thanks again for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another ITIF event soon.